The library at Pemberton Hall was lit by 4 candles and the dying remains of a coal fire, and Miss Cecily Marwood stood at the writing table in the far corner, with a ledger open before her and her heart beating in a place she could not quite locate. She had not been invited into this room. She had followed a single instinct, the same cold, unhurried instinct she had been following all her life, the one that read a room the way her father had taught her to read a page, and said the answer was not where they told you to look. She had taken the ledger from its shelf, third from the left, behind the collected sermons of Bishop Fleetwood, where it would not be found by anyone who did not know precisely what they were searching for, and she had opened it. And she had understood what she was reading inside the first 3 minutes. The door opened without a knock. The man who stepped in from the corridor was not a footman. He was tall, dark-coated, with the composed and deliberately expressionless face of a man who had learned to let nothing register before he intended it to. She recognized him. Edward Thorne, the Earl of Dunmore. She had seen him twice in 6 months, once at a concert in Grosvenor Square and once at the card table at which Viscount Ashcroft had ruined her evening by making the room laugh at her expense. Dunmore had said nothing. Either time, she had not decided what that silence meant. He looked at her. He looked at the ledger open in her hands. He looked at her again, and something shifted in his face. Not surprise. Not quite relief. Something in between, grave and controlled and threaded with a feeling she would not name until much later. He did not take the ledger from her. He did not tell her to put it down. He said, in a very low voice, "How much have you read?" Cecily looked back at him steadily. Her leg ached. It always ached at this hour, when she had been standing too long, and she had been standing too long, and she was not going to let it show any more than he was going to let whatever was happening in his face show enough, she said. That was the word. That was where it began. She had been enough of a great many things in her life, most of them insufficient, and she had learned to work with what was left. Cecily Marwood was the daughter of the Reverend Arthur Marwood, who had been curate at St. Bin, John the Baptist in the village of Holcombe, Wiltshire, and who had possessed, in lieu of money or influence, a library of 463 volumes, and an absolute conviction that his only child's mind was as fine as any he had encountered. He had taught her Greek before she was 10. He had taught her the cipher systems of Vigenère and Porta as a form of arithmetic amusement, the way another father might have taught a son card games. He had not intended this education as a preparation for anything specific. He had simply believed that a mind capable of learning deserved to learn, regardless of whether the world had designed a place for what it learned. He had died in the autumn of her 21st year, leaving her £3, 11 shillings, and the 463 volumes. The lameness predated his death by 8 years. She had fallen from a borrowed horse at 13, an undignified fall from an animal too large for her, an offense she should not have been jumped, and the left leg had healed imperfectly, leaving her with the pronounced limp that she had long since incorporated into her carriage as simply a fact of how she moved through rooms. She did not disguise it. She had tried briefly to disguise it, and had abandoned the effort on the grounds that the disguise required more energy than the truth. She was not ashamed of her leg. She was bored by the way it made other people feel either uncomfortable or superior, and she had given up managing that as well. She was employed as a secretary companion to Mrs. Penna. Dorothea Prentice, the Countess of Harwell, who was 73 and acute, and almost certainly the most intelligent person in any room she entered, including rooms that also contained cabinet ministers and bishops. Mrs. Prentice had hired Cecily 18 months ago, for reasons she stated plainly. But she needed someone who could read Latin correspondence without pretending she could not, keep accounts without requiring them to be checked, and discuss the relative merits of Addison and Locke without treating that discussion as an affectation. Mrs. Prentice did not find Cecily's limp relevant, and had not mentioned it once in 18 months, which placed her in a category of human beings Cecily had largely given up expecting to encounter. The Countess moved in good society, and so Cecily moved in good society behind her, as companions do present, functional, forgettable. The season had absorbed her without registering her. She attended concerts, salons, card parties, private dinners, where she was seated at the lower end of the table, and she observed them all with the same patient, unhurried attention she had once brought to her father's cipher exercises. It was at one of Lord Ashcroft's salons in the library anteroom that she had first heard herself described. The salon was the kind of gathering that Viscount Gerald Ashcroft specialized in, well-appointed, politically useful, designed to make men of rank feel cultivated and cultivated men feel significant. And Ashcroft was 38, polished in a way that read as effortless, but was not, and socially omnipresent in a manner that had begun to suggest something other than pure sociability. He was close to several ministry figures, invited always to the significant tables, given access to conversations that were not quite public and not quite private. He had a way of being precisely where information flowed. Cecily had stepped into the anteroom to retrieve Mrs. Prentice's shawl from the chair where she had left it, and had paused just inside the door, because two women were already there, deep in the particular kind of conversation that does not stop, but merely lowers when a third person enters. Lady Ashcroft was speaking. She was the Viscount's mother, a woman of 60, whose authority in this city had calcified over decades into something very close to geology. Her voice was not unkind, in the way that wounds are not unkind when they are clean. It simply did exactly what it set out to do. "Mrs. Prentice has brought the lame blue stocking again," Lady Ashcroft said to her companion with a note of patient amusement. "One does not know whether to admire the Countess's charity or pity her taste. A woman who cannot enter a room without counting the chairs to see where she might safely stand is not an ornament. She is a problem requiring placement." Her companion said something indistinct in reply. "One feels it," Lady Ashcroft said. "The reaching, the scholarship. It is the same quality in a woman as in a piece of furniture, useful in its proper situation, embarrassing when it presents itself in the drawing-room and expects to be admired." Cecily retrieved Mrs. Merbaude Prentice's shawl. She did not hurry. She walked back to the door she had come in through, closed it softly behind her, and spent the remainder of the evening doing what she always did, observing and cataloguing, and remaining precisely where she was placed. She did not allow herself then or later to rehearse what she might have said. The card party at Pemberton Hall 6 weeks later was a larger affair, with 40 guests, supper at 11, cards from 9, and conversation before that in the various overfurnished rooms that Ashcroft's family had been filling with expensive objects since the reign of George II. Cecily attended in her capacity as Mrs. Prentice's companion, and was seated at the smaller table, which suited her entirely, because the smaller table had better light. She was working through a hand of commerce with 2 mild-mannered solicitors and a baronet's wife when Ashcroft drew near. He was in good spirits, meaning he was performing good spirits, and had brought with him the small audience such men always trail. "Miss Marwood," he said, with a particular kind of warmth in his voice that Cecily had learned to identify as the warm-up before the punchline. "Still at your books, I take it? Someone told me you have been cataloguing Lady Harwell's estate correspondence. In Latin." He paused, letting the pause do the work it was meant to do. "I confess, I find it charming. A blue stocking with a limp. One is never short of something unusual in London, if one knows where to look." The table did not laugh loudly. It did not need to. The small sound that moved through the group was a contained, elegant amusement. It was sufficient. Cecily said nothing. She studied the cards in her hand. She was aware of the precise location of every person at the adjacent tables, as she was always aware of the location of every person in any room she occupied, as a matter of habit and necessity. She was aware specifically of the man standing near the fireplace, who had not moved during Ashcroft's small performance. The Earl of Dunmore was watching the exchange with a face that gave nothing away at all. She raised her eyes very briefly to his. He looked back. Then he looked at Ashcroft, then at his own glass. And that was what he did. He looked away. She played her hand. What she had noticed about Ashcroft's ledger was not yet in her possession then. It would come later. Cecily had, over many years, trained herself, over a life that required her to read situations quickly and without the luxury of direct information, to notice things other people did not think worth noting. And what she noticed about Ashcroft across 3 salons and a card party and a concert, at which he had spoken twice with a man in a gray coat, she did not recognize, was that he moved through rooms as if collecting something. Not admiration. Not influence, exactly. Something more specific and more transferable. She filed the observation. She did not yet have anywhere to put it. The commission arrived in the 3rd week of January. Mrs. Quat. Prentice had a long acquaintance with the Earl of Dunmore's household, for she had been a friend of his late mother's, and retained a warm, if formal, connection to the family. When Lord Dunmore sent a note requesting the use of Miss Marwood's document skills in connection with a complicated estate matter, specifically certain correspondence inherited from his father that required translation from its original Italian, Mrs. Prentice forwarded the request with her own endorsement and a note to Cecily that managed to convey approval, amusement, and something more guarded, all in 3 lines. She went on a Thursday morning with her father's notebook in her coat pocket as she always carried it, and was shown to a study that smelled of old paper and was otherwise austere to the point of self-advertisement. Dunmore was already there. He had laid out a sheaf of correspondence and a letter of context. He was formal, precise, and completely correct. He addressed her as Miss Marwood, thanked her for coming, and showed her to a writing table that had been prepared with the appropriate materials. She began. He worked at his own desk, and she could feel his attention on her without looking up the way one can sometimes feel a second source of light. In a room, she did not look up. She had learned, over 18 months of working in other people's houses, that the surest way to break a man's concentration was to acknowledge it. The Italian correspondence dated from the previous century, the handwriting deteriorating across the decades into a compressed, personal script that most translators would have required a week to work through cleanly. Cecily worked through it in the way her father had trained her to work through difficult texts, beginning with structural identification and proceeding to word-by-word parsing only where the context failed to supply the meaning. She wrote in the margins as she went, small notations in a hand her father would have recognized. After an hour, she had transcribed and translated 18 letters, summarized their substance in a marginal note, and flagged 2 passages for his particular attention with a small notation her father had used, a circle with a horizontal line through it, meaning, attend here, the argument turns. Dunmore came to stand at her shoulder. He looked at the summary sheet. He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that is not absence of response, but the presence of it being held in. "Where did you learn this notation?" he asked. "My father," she said. "He was a clergyman. He was a scholar who happened to hold a living," she said. The scholarship came first. She could feel him reading the annotations. She did not turn her head. Another silence. Then he said, "Could you read a corrupted text? A document whose hand is difficult or whose key is not immediately obvious?" She looked up at him. Then, she had been expecting the question. Not this question precisely, but the shape underneath it. The particular form of oblique approach that a man uses when he needs something and is not sure he has the right to ask for it. "That depends on what kind of corruption," she said carefully, "and what kind of key." He held her gaze. He was not performing anything. He was, she thought, asking her something that cost him something, and managing not to let that cost show, and not quite succeeding, which told her the cost was real. "There are documents," he said, "that I have been unable to parse. For 3 years. If there was a moment that she would return to afterward, it was that one. Not the library at Pemberton Hall with the ledger open in her hands. Not the morning. When she had finished her reading and understood completely what she held. This one. The study. The winter light. The 3 years in his voice, patient and worn with their own weight. She said, Then you should show them to me." The ledger arrived the following week, delivered by a secretary with a sealed note that read, in his hand, that he had carried this for 8 months, suspected its nature but could not confirm it, and that she was under no obligation. What? She sat with it in Mrs. Prentice's morning room for the better part of a day. The cipher was elegant, a polyalphabetic substitution with a key phrase she identified within the first 2 hours by analysis of letter frequency, the method her father had taught her as I Capley on winter evenings in Holcombe. Once the key was found, the ledger opened. What she read did not surprise her. She had been watching Ashcroft for 6 weeks with the particular cold patience she brought to things she did not yet understand but suspected were important. She had expected something venal. What she found was something worse. The ledger was a record of payments received. The entries were dated. The payers were identified by initials and a secondary code she required another hour to resolve. What they had paid for was recorded in a series of notations that were once deciphered, perfectly plain. Coordinates, routes, timetables, information that could only have come from ministry contacts or Admiralty channels. Information that had, in several cases she could date, corresponded to the losses of English vessels in the Channel. She checked the dates 3 times. The third entry from the left, on a page dated the 14th of October, 3 years past, corresponded to a departure corridor in the Channel. She knew this because she had read about it afterward, in the newspapers, in the account of the loss of the sloop Ardent in that corridor. In that week 8 men dead, among them an officer named Thorne. She sat with that knowledge for a very long time. She thought about what it would mean to bring this forward. She was a companion secretary. She was the daughter of a dead country clergyman. She was a woman who had been described, in the receiving rooms of this city, as a lame bluestocking, and not by the lowest people in those rooms. She had no political connection, no family name that would open a door at the Home Office, no voice that the relevant men were constitutionally inclined to hear. There was a specific fear involved, and she examined it the way she examined difficult texts, by sitting with it until she could name its components precisely. She was afraid that she would present the ledger and the decipherment, and 37 pages of annotation, and the assembled gentlemen would listen politely for several minutes, and then explain in the patient tone reserved for women who have overstepped that this was a household account, and she had clearly misunderstood the notations, and that they would be grateful if she returned the ledger to its owner. She was afraid that Ashcroft would say in his familiar warm voice that the lame bluey stocking had been amusing herself by constructing fantasies from documents she was not equipped to understand, and that the room would laugh, and that this time there would be no Dunmore standing at the fireplace with a face she was trying to learn to read, because Dunmore would be among the men she had failed to persuade. She sat with those fears until they had given her everything they contained. Then she set them aside. She thought about Dunmore, who had those things, and about his 3 years, and about the particular way he had looked at her across the card table at Pemberton Hall. Not the look of a man about to speak, but the look of a man who understood that the moment had passed. She thought about a notation in the margin of a letter she had translated on a Thursday morning in January, the small circle with the horizontal line, and the way he had bent over it and been silent for a long time before he asked her anything at all. She thought about Ashcroft, who was hosting Lord Harwick, and 3 ministry officials at a gathering at Pemberton Hall in 4 days. She thought about her father's notebook in her pocket, the leather worn soft as cloth, the cipher tables inked in his careful handwriting across the first 6 pages. She closed the ledger. She opened her father's notebook. She wrote out the key and the full decipherment in her own hand, with marginal citations to the dates and vessels and newspaper reports she could verify, in the spare annotated style her father had taught her, the one that left no ambiguity about what the document said, or what she had done to make it legible. Then she sat quietly in the morning room, until Mrs. Prentice came in for tea. She had not told the Countess what she was doing. She had not needed to. Mrs. Prentice had seen the ledger arrive, had seen Cecily receive it, and had said only, "I trust you will be careful," and then had returned to her correspondence. It was the morning of the 3rd day, while she was completing her notes, that the footman mentioned it. He was a young man named Peters, who had been with the Countess 6 years, and who had developed over those years a habit of informing Miss Marwood about things she might like to know. He was not malicious. He had a sense of fairness that expressed itself in the passing of information. He had been at a supper 2 nights previous at Lord Ashcroft's house, assisting with the service. He had been in the hall when a group of gentlemen came out from the dining room. He had heard Ashcroft say, and he repeated it with the embarrassed fidelity of a man quoting something he found distasteful, that the Countess of Harwell's lame bluestocking had apparently taken to fancying herself a useful person, and that someone should explain to the Countess that a dog, trained to fetch the morning paper, was not thereby qualified to advise on its contents. Peter said, "I thought you ought to know, miss. I don't think it was right." Cecily thanked him. She finished her notes. She set down her pen. She looked at what she had made. 37 pages of clear decipherment, cited and annotated, in language that any educated reader could follow. It was the clearest piece of scholarship she had produced since her father's death. It was also, she understood with the particular clarity that comes when fear has been fully processed and set aside, the only thing standing between Ashcroft and his continued freedom. She picked it up. She put it in the leather document case she used for Mrs. Prentice's correspondence. She went to find the Countess. "I need to be at Pemberton Hall on Friday evening," she said. "Not as your companion. In my own right." Mrs. Prentice looked at her for a moment, with the acute, unhurried expression of a woman who had been reading situations accurately for 73 years. "Then you shall go in my carriage," she said. "And I shall come with you." The gathering at Pemberton Hall on the evening of the 28th was, by Ashcroft's customary standard, a restrained affair, with 30 guests, supper at 9, a library reception beforehand, where the conversation was managed toward specific political outcomes with the elegant opacity of a man who had been doing this for 20 years. Lord Harwick was there as expected, with 2 of his secretaries, 3 ministry figures, several senior peers, the usual arrangements of a room built for purposes that were not advertised in the invitation. Cecily arrived with Mrs. Cheller. Prentice. She was, as always, furniture. She accepted a glass she did not drink from, positioned herself near the shelf she knew, and waited for the particular quality of social gravity that accumulates when important men begin to concentrate in a single place. Dunmore was there. She had not known with certainty that he would be, and his presence produced in her a feeling she did not examine. He was standing with Lord Harwick near the fireplace, and she could see from across the room that the conversation was the kind that occupies the body while the mind is elsewhere. He saw her. He understood. Immediately, she could see that he understood. What she was carrying in the document case under her arm. His face changed in a way she had not seen it change before. Not the controlled diplomatic composure she had watched him manage across 2 rooms in 6 months, but something underneath it, the thing the composure was designed to hold. He crossed the room. He did it slowly, which was worse because it drew no attention. "Miss Marwood," he said quietly. "Lord Dunmore," she said. "You have read it." "I have read it." He looked at the document case. "All of it." "Including the 14th of October, she said, 3 years ago. His jaw set. It was the smallest motion, a single tightening at the hinge, and she had spent 6 months learning to read him, and she read it plainly. "I'm going to read it to Lord Harwick," she said. "I would prefer to do so with you present, but I will do it in any case." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel the room going on around them, the particular oblivious momentum of a social gathering that does not yet know it is about to become something else. "You understand what Ashcroft will say," Dunmore said. "He will say what he has been saying for 3 years, Cecily said. "Only this time I will have the ledger in my hands when he says it." Dunmore looked at her. The thing in his face resolved into something she could not quite name, but recognized, the way one sometimes recognizes a piece of music heard once before in a different key. "Then we will go together," he said. She had not asked him for that. She had not, in composing her courage across the 3 previous days, built her plan around it. She accepted it for what it was, which was not rescue. And they crossed the room. The group around Lord Harwick opened for Dunmore with the automatic courtesy of rank, and closed again behind Cecily, with a brief flicker of recalibration. Harwick was a big-framed man of 60, with a face that had spent decades absorbing unpleasant information without visible response. He looked at Cecily the way such men look at unexpected elements in a familiar equation, not dismissive, but requiring explanation. "Lord Harwick," Dunmore said, "I think you should hear Miss Marwood." Ashcroft was 4 feet away. He had turned at the sound of his own library being reorganized without his permission. He was smiling, which was what he did when he was deciding how to make a problem disappear. "Miss Marwood," he said, with the familiar warmth, "I was not aware you had been invited this evening. Have you lost your countess, or has she simply sent you ahead to mind the books?" The room shifted. Several faces turned. Cecily opened the document case. She took out the leather-covered ledger. His ledger. The one she had carried from Mrs. Brack. Prentice's morning room. To this room in her own 2 hands, and she placed it on the library table, and she opened it to the first page. "I have not lost anything," she said, "but I believe you have." She began to read. She read the cipher key first, her own derivation of it, methodical and plain, then the decipherment, column by column, entry by entry, the dates, the coded payees, the payments received, the information provided. She read in the voice she had developed for reading complex material aloud, unhurried and precise, carrying only as much emphasis as the text itself required. Her leg ached. She stood. Ashcroft said after the 3rd entry, "This is preposterous." She did not pause. After the 7th entry, he said, "This woman, someone stop this. She is a companion secretary who has constructed a fantasy from a household account ledger. She is nothing." "The lame bluey stocking," someone said from the back of the room, in a voice that did not sound like mockery. She continued. She read the entry for the 14th of October. She read its plain meaning, the channel corridor, and the departure times, and the fee received. She read it twice because it deserved to be read twice. The room had gone entirely still. Ashcroft said, in a voice that had shed several layers of its accustomed polish, "You have no idea what you are doing." "I have a complete idea," Cecily said. She closed the ledger. She set her 37 pages of decipherment on the table beside it. Every entry is annotated. The cipher derivation is on the first 3 pages. The sources I used for the naval losses are cited in the margin. "Lord Harwick," she said, looking up, "the annotations are in a form I believe you will find usable." Harwick picked up the first sheet. He read it for 20 seconds. He turned to one of his secretaries and said, in a conversational tone, "Fetch Clements." He looked at Ashcroft. Ashcroft looked back at him with the expression of a man who had just understood that the script he had been following for 20 years had run out of pages. Lady Ashcroft, who had been standing at the edge of the group, said nothing. She closed her fan. She closed it very slowly, the ribs clicking one by one, and she held it in both hands and stared at her son. And her face wore an expression that Cecily, who had excellent practice at reading expressions, understood to be the collapse of a certainty she had never thought to question. Dunmore had said nothing during all of this. He had stood to Cecily's left, slightly behind her, and his presence had been what it was. Not support in the theatrical sense, simply weight. The kind of weight that steadies a room without announcing itself. He turned to Lord Harwick. He said, his voice entirely level, "Miss Marwood read what I could not. She ends this. 10 words, that was all." Lord Harwick looked at him nonetheless, and then at Cecily, with the particular attention of a man reassessing a situation he thought he had already understood. "Miss Marwood," Harwick said. "My lord," she said, "you will come with me." She picked up her annotated pages and followed him. The remainder of that evening was procedural. Harwick's secretary, Clemence, arrived. Ashcroft's protests were recorded, first energetically, And then, as the evening progressed and the annotations proved impeccable, with decreasing conviction. Two of the ministry figures withdrew to a corner and had a conversation that lasted 40 minutes. Lady Ashcroft was assisted by a footman from the room. The party dispersed in the particular quiet way that parties disperse when everyone present has understood that something significant has occurred and is not certain what they are supposed to say about it. Mrs. Prentice found Cecily in the corridor after midnight and pressed her hand without a word. Dunmore was waiting near the door. He had his coat and hat, and stood with the careful stillness of a man who has decided to wait and is not going to change that decision regardless of how long it takes. When she came to him, they stood for a moment in the hall with the noise of the carriage arrangements filtering from outside. "You should have had a solicitor," he said, "or a senior peer. You should not have had to do that alone." "I was not alone," she said. "You were there." "I was not there when Ashcroft mocked you at the card table," he said. "I was not there when he said it to the room. I saw it, and I let it pass, and I am not going to pretend that I have forgotten it." She looked at him. The hall was cold and quiet, and lit by a single lamp that put the strong planes of his face in partial shadow. "Why did you let it pass?" she asked. "Because I thought," he said, and stopped. "I told myself it was beneath the moment, that engaging with it would dignify it. That was not true." He looked at her with the directness she had come to understand was not coldness at all but precision, the look of a man who says exactly what he means, and no more. "I let it pass because I was watching you, and I thought she did not need me to defend her. She is already past it. She is already somewhere else in her mind. And I was right that you were somewhere else. I should still have said something." "Yes," she agreed. "You should have." A silence. "Thomas was my brother," he said. "The ardent." He was the sailing master. She had known this. She had known it for 4 days, since she had cross-referenced the passenger list in the newspaper report. She had sat with the knowledge of it as she sat with most difficult knowledge, long enough to understand its shape before she was required to respond to it. "I know," she said. "Then you know why I have been carrying this for 3 years." "I know," she said again. "And I know that you could not have done what I did not from where you were standing." He was quiet. "My father taught me," she said, "that knowledge is only useful if you can communicate it clearly. He meant it as scholarship. I have been applying it as a practical matter for 24 years. "It is," she said carefully, "the thing I can do. It is one of the things you can do," Dunmore said, and something in his voice had shifted, some last-held restraint giving way into plain statement. "Cecily." It was the first time. She stood very still. "I am going to ask you something," he said, "and I would like you to understand before I ask it, that it is not gratitude. Gratitude is its own thing, and it is real, and it would be dishonest to pretend I do not feel it, but it is not what I am asking from. I am asking from something I have been suppressing since a Thursday morning in January when you annotated 18 documents in an hour and then looked up and caught me watching you and said absolutely nothing about it." Cecily considered him. "Ask it," she said. He asked. It was February before the matter was fully resolved. The proceedings against Ashcroft moved through the mechanisms they were required to move through, with the deliberate pace of legal machinery that cannot be hurried. Harwick sent a note. 2 additional notes followed. A solicitor came to Mrs. Cull, Prentice's house on a Tuesday, and spoke with Cecily for 90 minutes, during which she produced her annotations in full and answered every question with the unhurried precision that had by that point been noted in several official documents as uncommon. She moved out of Mrs. Prentice's house in the 2nd week of February. Not because the Countess had asked her to. Mrs. Prentice had not asked her to do anything except choose carefully and report back in detail. She left because the arrangement for which she was moving had been discussed, proposed, accepted, and confirmed in the manner appropriate to such things, including the relevant meeting with a solicitor, the relevant announcement in the correct register, and the relevant conversation between Dunmore and Mrs. Tran. Prentice that lasted 2.5 hours and concluded with the Countess saying that she expected to be kept informed. She moved into the Dunmore house on a Thursday, which pleased her, because Thursday had acquired a specific significance she was not prepared to surrender. The sitting room she had been given at the back of the house faced south and received the afternoon light through 2 windows that wanted reglazing, but let in a warmth that suited her. There was a fireplace that drew well. There was a writing table of a quality she had not previously used, with a leather surface that would take ink without bleeding. She placed her father's notebook on the writing table. It was smaller than she remembered it being in her childhood, which was not true. It was the same size it had always been. 4 inches by 6, the leather worn to a color that was no longer brown and not quite gray. The spine had been repaired twice, with glue that had dried to a slightly different shade each time. The cipher tables inside were her father's handwriting, small and careful, and organized with the economy of a man who had a great deal to say and limited paper to say it on. She had been carrying it for 3 years. She would keep it here. Outside the window, the garden was still winter bare, the beds turned and waiting. A single sparrow on the stone edge of the fountain. The fire behind her put warmth across her back. Somewhere in the house, a clock was measuring the afternoon. Dunmore appeared in the doorway. He had been to the Home Office that morning, and had returned, as he did, with the careful, composed energy of a man who had spent several hours being more diplomatic than he felt like being. He looked at her at the writing table. He looked at the notebook. "That is your father's," he said. "Yes." He came in and stood beside her and looked down at the notebook for a moment with the particular attention he brought to things that mattered to her. He would have liked the problem, she said. Ashcroft's cipher. He would have sat with it for a morning and explained the key to me over dinner, as if it were perfectly obvious, and then listened to everything I said about how I had solved it, and told me which steps were efficient, and which I had made harder than they needed to be. Would he have been right? About the inefficiencies? 3 of the 4, probably. She considered. He was very rarely wrong about the things he cared about. Dunmore was quiet for a moment. The sparrow outside had been joined by another. "I think," he said, "that the January commission was not strictly about Italian correspondence." "No," she said. "It was not. I needed to see how you worked," he said, "before I asked you to do the other thing. I needed to know it was possible." "I know," she said. "That was not entirely honest of me." "No," she said, "but it was not unkind." She looked up at him. "And you could not have simply asked. You had carried it alone for 3 years. You did not know yet how to ask." He looked at her. The light from the south window was the particular quality of English winter afternoon, pale and clean and slightly elegiac, and it fell across his face in a way that did not soften it, but rendered it, finally as she had first suspected it to be, grave and specific and not cold at all. "I know now," he said. She reached out and put her hand over his. It was a small gesture, direct and plain, and she held it for a moment before returning to the notebook. The fire settled behind them. Outside, the 2 sparrows argued briefly about the fountain's edge, and then resolved their difficulty by the simple means of sharing the space, which Cecily thought was a reasonable approach to most problems. She opened her father's notebook to the first page. The cipher tables were exactly where they had always been, ink slightly faded, every symbol present. She was home. The fire crackled behind her, and the garden held its winter quiet in the afternoon light. Pale and clean, moved slowly across the cipher tables her father had inked with such patience, in such careful small strokes, as if he had known they would need to last. "If you have stayed until the end, thank you. Leave a word below about which moment held you. Cecily and the stories like hers live as long as we keep telling them."